Although the war ended decades ago, the things it left behind keep appearing. Some were discovered by chance. Others remained hidden in silence, intact. What was found after the conflict was not always weapons or documents. In many cases, they were hidden spaces, buried objects, or locked rooms that no one had stepped into again. Every find revealed a part of the system that functioned on every scale, from the industrial to the symbolic. Nothing was left to chance. Every corner built by the regime had a purpose. Some were easy to understand, others, even today, remain unexplained. The disturbing thing was not only what was found, but how and where it was kept. Underground chambers, locked laboratories, camouflaged surveillance rooms. Everything was part of something that did not end in 1945. It only changed form. How far did the Nazi regime go to hide its darkest secrets? During some renovation work on the highest part of an old building, some workers stumbled upon something completely unexpected. As they dismantled sections of the roof, they noticed an opening inside a wall that was not on any plans. It was a carefully covered hole. Upon entering, they discovered that it was not rubble or random remains. They were facing a meticulously prepared compartment. Inside that small, hidden space, there was a collection of objects that seemed frozen in time, flags with black crosses on a white and red background, intact armbands, portraits of a leader who marked the century, youth manuals and books with graphic messages. Everything was in perfect condition, as if it had been stored the day before. The site where this stash appeared had functioned decades ago as a youth meeting center under the state structure of the time. It was not a casual find. Someone had decided to store these elements very carefully, perhaps anticipating that the regime would not last. The objects were not piled up or thrown around. Each one had an exact place. There was an order that suggested an intention to preserve them, not to hide them in a hurry. This discovery did not occur in just any place. It was a public building, a school used during the war as a center for youth indoctrination. From the outside, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but within its walls, a time capsule of the past had been silently kept. The materials were handed over to the local museum, where they began to be examined one by one. Although they were not unique pieces, the way they were stored and the place where they were found gave them additional weight. This find showed how even places dedicated to teaching may have been used to sow ideas for control purposes. The books, the uniforms, the insignias were not just symbolism. They were training tools, used to mold the thinking of those who grew up under that structure. After being restored, some of these objects became part of a traveling exhibition, designed to explain how the regime had penetrated all social levels. The hiding place, which remained invisible for years, became concrete proof of a process that rarely left such orderly traces. Without the need to travel too far, there is another construction in the same country that was also prepared as a symbol. In the middle of a hill, an ancient stone castle was selected by one of the most influential hierarchs of that government. It was not a capricious choice. That site was adapted with specific intent. They wanted to transform it into a special center, not only physical but symbolic. In its lowest part, below the levels accessible to the public, a circular chamber was enabled, made with dark blocks, without windows, without visible decoration. Only stone, rigid forms, absolute symmetry. In the center of the room, a slab was placed, and around it, 12 empty niches. The floor had a design engraved that did not appear in any other official building, a circular figure similar to a dark sun with 12 rays. That image was not decorative. It had been placed to convey a message, although it was not written what it was. The records do not detail for what purpose that room was used, nor are there photos of ceremonies there. It is only known that it was finished with priority and that it received high-level visits frequently. Those who worked on that remodeling did not do so by choice. They were people transferred from a nearby camp, forced to dig, load and place materials during extended shifts. Some died before seeing the structure finished. It was not just an architectural project, it was a construction with symbolic purpose. When the opposing forces occupied the place, they found it as it had been left. What was once considered a private center was transformed into part of a state museum. The underground room remained intact, its form, its disposition, the entry of light from an upper point that at certain moments illuminated the center of the room, everything remained the same. There were no signs, no plaques, only stone and silence. The site remained open to the public with clear restrictions. No acts, no gestures of homage, nor meetings of any kind are allowed. It is guarded and regulated. What was once a closed and exclusive space became part of the record of what was really designed at that moment in history. Today, it is toured as a ruin is toured, but the stones do not speak. They are just there, showing without explaining. Not far away, among dense forests and mountainous terrain, another site built during the same years had a more direct function. No symbols were engraved there, nor were stone towers erected. What was excavated in that region was for a completely different purpose. When attacks from the air devastated visible industrial structures, the regime's solution was to take production underground. In that remote area, thousands of prisoners were forced to dig kilometers of tunnels by hand. There was no heavy machinery, only basic tools, hunger, and constant pressure. The passages were not simple caves. Inside, rails, generators, power lines, and assembly areas were installed. There, parts for armored vehicles, parts of heavy weaponry, and components of an airplane that flew faster than any other were assembled. The atmosphere was unbearable. Dust covered lungs, the air was dense, light failed. If a tunnel collapsed, no one got out. And if someone did not produce the minimum required, they did not eat. Bodies were taken away every day and replacements were brought in. The rhythm was constant, the value of life, non-existent. When the opposing army managed to reach that complex, they found a scene frozen in its horror. Machines stopped, incomplete structures, tools on the ground, and unmoved bodies. There were explosives still active. They were disarmed just in time. From then on, material kept coming out from underground. Metal remains, unused projectiles, abandoned parts, and also bones mixed with cement. Most of that system was sealed with concrete. Even so, every so often, when there are heavy rains or by accidental excavation, traces of what happened there appear. No one ever used those tunnels again. They were not cleaned, nor were they converted into anything else. Everything that was left there is still there. As the years passed, what remained under the sea began to say more than documents. Along the ocean that separated America from Europe, dozens of metal structures rest in absolute silence. They are not common wrecks or merchant ships. They are vessels designed not to be seen, to sink and disappear without a trace. German submarines, known for their lethality on the high seas, still remain underwater, sealed by pressure and cold. After advances in detection, many of them were shot down one by one. Some were found decades later in almost intact conditions, as if the ocean floor had frozen them at the exact moment of their sinking. Still with their compartments closed, with the paint barely eroded and the instruments in place. In several cases, the remains of the crews were still inside, motionless, as if time had not touched them. The sites where they were found are not open to visits. There is no tourism or rescue. They are considered places of eternal rest. The pressure of the depths keeps everything closed, as if the interior had been packed in silence. Some hulls have been documented in which there are still preserves, navigation maps and personal items that silently narrate what it was like to live underwater for weeks. In one of those finds, the hull remained complete, with only a front section damaged by the impact. Another was located next to the vessel it had attacked, as if both had been trapped at the same moment. Each one tells a story that does not appear in books, the tension of a war without a surface, in reduced spaces and without escape. Although they are hidden in the depths, they are not forgotten. Modern technology allowed several of these submersibles to be found. Each location was registered, protected by international conventions. No one can touch them without permission. No one can open them. They are structures that no longer represent a threat, but they do show the silent cost of that prolonged struggle under the sea. While the invisible traces of that war slept under the ocean, another symbol of the same regime emerged from the bottom, but on another continent. Far from the European front, in calm waters near South America, a rescue operation managed to bring to the surface a piece of almost 400 kilograms. It was a bronze figure, a bird with extended wings, holding an emblem. For decades it had been there under the sea mud, adhered to the remains of a ship that sank in the first stage of the global conflict. That ship, considered an early threat to trade routes, was finally cornered by naval forces in an encirclement maneuver. With no possibility of escape or receiving help, it was the commander himself who decided to send it to the bottom, symbol and all. The sculpture remained there ever since, trapped among silt, metal and currents. Its recovery was technical, slow, and carried out with equipment prepared exclusively for that task. When the figure was taken out of the water, it preserved its form, its weight, and its presence. It was briefly exhibited in a controlled space. Quickly, claims began from governments demanding that it not be used as a trophy or as a piece out of context. It was not just any relic. It represented something that still divides and causes tension. In the end, the sculpture was removed from public view. It was sold under specific conditions. It was not revealed who acquired it. It was only known that it would no longer be available to be shown without authorization. What remained was the memory of a symbolic object that had crossed generations unseen. It came to light, generated controversy, and disappeared again. Like many elements of that era, its value was not in the material, but in what it represented. It was not just a naval piece. It was an ideological vestige rescued from the silence of the ocean. Almost in parallel, but on the other side of the channel that divides France from the United Kingdom, another set of structures remained standing, without the need for excavations or rescues. There, in island territories that were once occupied, visible remains of what was a disproportionate defensive strategy remain in place. When the regime extended its control to these British islands close to the continent, it quickly turned them into a military stronghold. Tunnels were dug, reinforced concrete posts were built, turrets, warehouses, ventilation systems, and command rooms were installed. Each of these constructions had a purpose: to anticipate an attack that never occurred. The roads were modified to connect the bunkers. The beaches were surrounded by firing points. Even the hills were perforated to hide ammunition and soldiers. The work was carried out by forced labor. It was not voluntary. The infrastructure grew as the regime's situation worsened. While troops retreated on the continent, defenses on these islands increased. It seemed like a contradiction, strengthening a site of no strategic importance while everything else collapsed. When the conflict ended, many of these structures were left empty, unused. Some were closed. Others remained as they were. Over time, vegetation covered parts of them, but they did not disappear. They are still there, as visible traces of a massive preparation for an invasion that never came. In certain areas, the walls still show the same grey tones, the armoured doors still resist the passage of time, and the passageways have not collapsed. There are spaces where the confinement can still be felt, where humidity continues to descend through the walls, and where darkness does not change with the years. The memory of that occupation remains etched not only in the stories, but in the concrete. These islands were converted into a kind of external fortress that was never tested. What was once planned as an impenetrable line of defense became a set of military ruins that now form part of the everyday landscape. While the railway routes continued to reach the imaginable limit, a group of people hurriedly descended from the wagons. They were not given time to understand where they were. After a few steps, someone in a white coat decided, without explanation, who moved to one side and who disappeared to the back of a line. That selection was as quick as it was final. Among those who remained standing, some were not led with the rest. If they had any specific characteristic, if they were twins, if they showed deformities, or if they did not reach a certain height, they were separated. They were led to another point in the enclosure. They were not harshly interrogated. Only simple questions were asked. How many siblings, what kinship if they felt pain? The man who received them observed, took notes, marked. Then others arrived, extracted samples from them, made physical comparisons, weighed them, measured them. Sometimes substances were applied to their eyes. Other times, injections without explanation. Those who were taken to these sections did not know what was really happening. At first they thought it was a medical checkup. Some received more food, a closed place to sleep, some protection from the rest, but only as long as they served the purposes of the place. If one of the selected died during the process, the other was also eliminated just to maintain symmetry. It was not about healing, only about recording. Each of the steps was noted down. There were sheets with coded names, diagrams, anatomical drawings, and numbered vials. When the enemy army entered, they found that material still in place. Part had been hastily burned, but many folders were still there. Also instruments, vials with preserved remains, technical drawings, and a silence that explained nothing, but showed everything. The number of miners who underwent these procedures exceeds 1,000. Very few managed to get out. Most did not understand that it was part of a sequence, not a treatment. The doctor who directed them escaped before the end. He changed countries, names, lives. He never sat in a tribunal. Years later, remains matching his identity were found, but there was never a final declaration. Only fragments, bones, documents, and testimonies of those who still remember. Everything that was done in that basement was documented by those who survived. The place did not need to speak. It was enough to enter to understand. There were no commemorative plaques or ornaments, only walls with marks, uncleaned tables, and notebooks that said more than any trial could have said. In a closed structure far from urban traffic and without visible signage, a technical group entered to inspect what appeared to be a simple maintenance room. What they found did not match any known plans. There was an old metal hatch, sealed with rivets dating back decades. Upon forcing entry, what appeared was an unusually clean room, with walls covered in opaque plates and devices aligned on rust-free metal tables. One of the most striking artifacts was cylindrical in shape, with coiled windings and a core that seemed designed to emit fields. Beside it, there were glass tubes connected to primitive capacitors. Nothing was labeled. However, the technicians who inspected them immediately knew that these were not common mechanisms. There were diagrams with schemes of energy transmission, frequency calculations, and annotated distances. Everything suggested that those instruments had been used to experiment with the possibility of sending electricity through the air without the need for physical cables. The documents found among the shelves were written with precise calligraphy, mixing electrical terms with military language. Some sheets mentioned names of scientists related to the regime. Everything seemed to indicate that this room had been an experimental laboratory, intentionally hidden. No evidence of destruction or signs of abrupt abandonment were found. On the contrary, the devices were assembled, the tools aligned, and the papers stored in order. The idea of transmitting energy without direct contact was considered advanced even decades later. But in that place, everything was already in the testing phase. It was never known for certain if the system actually worked, or if it was an unsuccessful attempt. The truth is that the space was closed for years and was only rediscovered by chance. Today it remains under official custody. What was experimented with there is not found in manuals or public archives. It only exists through the rescued components and the technical reports that were not eliminated. Not far from that enclosure, in an area that had been walled up with concrete, another room was discovered by a team inspecting old underground facilities. Upon breaking part of the wall, a dense, heavy air was released, forcing everyone present to evacuate. Sensors indicated a higher than normal radiation presence. The room, when fully opened with special suits, revealed broken instruments, corroded cans and containers with sealed waste. Some of them bore warning symbols, others were unmarked. In the center, there was a circular platform and around it, broken cables connected to already useless screens. In a corner, a laboratory blackboard showed a formula written in chalk, still visible, with references to uranium. No people capable of explaining what was found remained nearby. Only the material remains offered clues. Among the partially destroyed papers, terms like measurement, intensity, and reaction could be distinguished. The researchers concluded that radioactive materials had been tested there, possibly in search of accelerated results for some type of energy or weaponry. There was no adequate shielding, nor were there official records indicating the use of the site. The place was immediately sealed after the discovery. No sample was removed without special authorization. Everything remained under technical control, without public access. Although no human remains were found, there were signs of sudden abandonment, fallen tools, overturned desks, and disconnected cables in mid-use. No one could confirm if it was evacuated due to an emergency or if it was simply forgotten after the collapse of the regime. To this day, that room remains sealed. It is one of the most dangerous spaces discovered in facilities of that period. Its existence does not appear in any military archive. It was only possible to find it due to the partial degradation of the cement that covered it. When the conflict ended and Allied troops began to sweep through the territories controlled by the regime, not all installations were detected immediately. In a wooded sector, under a simple structure covered by vegetation, a rusted hatch leading to a lower level was found. What at first seemed like a simple shelter became one of the most complete finds in terms of encrypted communication technology. Upon descending, narrow corridors with metal-lined walls were found, with cables still attached to the guides. The interior rooms were lined with desks, switchboards and devices that had been used to receive and send messages. On a central table there was an intact coding machine with its mechanism unassembled. The keyboard, the internal rollers and the wooden covers remained as if someone had left just a few minutes before. The machine matched in design the models known as Enigma, though with some modifications that did not appear in previous records. Beside it were piles of papers with coded annotations, many of them still undeciphered. Some fragments showed numerical series, names of locations, and precisely marked times. Everything indicated that the place operated as an independent transmission center, possibly linked to strategic movements on different fronts. The electrical panels were still mounted. The internal telephone lines were still connected. In an adjacent room, reel recorders and rudimentary microphones were found that had been used to record incoming messages. No trace of destruction was found. Nothing had been burned or dismantled. It was as if the occupants had left with the intention of returning, but they never did. Technical reports on the find concluded that this center operated until the last days of the regime. It was one of the few underground stations where activity stopped without external intervention. Apparently, its remote location allowed it to be preserved almost in its original state. All the material was extracted with extreme care, and several of the transmissions are still being studied by specialists in historical cryptography. Although it seemed difficult to surpass, another more discreet find caught the attention of researchers a short time later. It was not a factory or a laboratory. It was a perfectly camouflaged circular room, designed to observe without being seen. It was discovered by accident when a group of specialists in abandoned structures noticed a slight deformation in the terrain next to an old operational base. Upon excavating, a sealed entrance with compacted earth was found. Upon entering, a room with no furniture appeared, but with rotating walls and disguised skylights around the perimeter. The entire design was oriented towards a single purpose, to allow visual tracking of the external environment without revealing the observer's position. The internal walls had hidden openings covered with optical filters. From the inside, one could look out, but from the outside, the existence of the room was not detected. There were no visible electrical cables, but there were manual mechanisms to control the openings. Remains of lenses and packaged optical parts were also found. Unlike other more industrial installations, this place showed no signs of extended use. There were no signs of lodging or personal items. Only technical tools, notes on tracing paper, and marks on the floor indicating calibrated observation points. The design deviated from typical defense or combat architecture. It was closer to covert visual tracking, perhaps to monitor weapons tests, training exercises, or movements within a restricted area. Some torn maps glued to the walls showed nearby coordinates, with lines drawn from the center of the room to specific points on the terrain. When the surroundings were checked, it was discovered that from that exact location, a wide expanse of the lower valley could be seen without being seen. Each opening was calculated to cover a different strip, as if it were a primitive sector-based monitoring system. The authorities sealed the room shortly after the discovery. It was not converted into a museum. It was only documented in internal reports. The technology used there, although simple, revealed a clear intention of visual control without exposure. And yet, at a more distant point, a structure was found that turned out to be even more disconcerting, this time in a wooded area to the east, far from any frequented route. There, a series of old installations partially covered by vegetation caught the attention of an inspection team. What seemed like a simple storage structure ended up revealing something much harder to classify. After dismantling a double rusted steel door, the group entered a dimly lit central room. In the corners, chains still hung attached to metal frames. The smell was dry, old, with traces of chemicals. There were no visible papers at first, but upon checking the lower compartments, trays with carefully labeled bone remains were found. The pieces did not correspond completely to any recognizable animal. Some had limbs that appeared fused, others had disproportionate teeth or elongated skulls that did not match any natural species. Anatomy experts consulted days later confirmed that these were animal remains, but with evident surgical interventions. They were not natural deformities. There were clean cuts, rudimentary implants, sutures with metallic threads, and joined parts that should not coexist. Among the remains, there were fragments of partially burned medical reports, where terms such as stability, adaptation, and response could be read. The sheets had no signature or official stamps. On a lower level of the installation, a small amphitheater with tiered benches and a central dissection table was found. The walls were covered with white tiles, already cracked by humidity. Next to a waterless sink, there were broken vials with evaporated liquids and labels in German with warning symbols. The entire place was not made to house people long-term. It was a site of technical observation, with visual records and conservation display cases. Everything indicated that repeated tests with animals were carried out there, probably seeking to modify behaviors or physical characteristics. There was no conclusive documentation on the exact purpose of the laboratory. Some researchers suggested that it could have been attempts to create specimens for military or biological study. Others considered the possibility of tests to prove substances in organisms with induced alterations. The only thing clear was that the remains found could not be attributed to any animal species without direct intervention. The place was sealed as soon as the inspections concluded. Its public opening was not authorized. The rescued samples were stored under technical custody. None were sent to museums, nor were there extensive official communiques. Only internal reports with restricted access were drafted. To this day, the images taken there have not been fully disclosed. The little that is known comes from technical records and accounts of those who participated in the find. The sum of what was discovered offered no answers, but it multiplied the questions. It showed that, parallel to what was visible and documented, hidden lines of work were developed, far from the front and from any external review. This find, due to its singularity, remains one of the most disconcerting in the entire repertoire of discoveries after the collapse of the regime. Not only for what it showed, but for what it insinuated. None of this was accidental. Every sealed tunnel, every closed room, every buried object was hidden with precision. It was not just about hiding evidence, but about ensuring that, if something went wrong, everything else would continue to function from the shadows. Amidst the chaos of the collapse, some archives disappeared. Others remained trapped in vaults that no one ever opened again. While the world celebrated the end of the war, armored trains, compartments with wireless energy, circular rooms designed to observe unseen and unexplained altered animal remains were still underground. What seemed destroyed was still there, halted for decades. And the most disturbing thing was not what these spaces showed, but what they suggested, that there was much more, and that a large part was never found. Every discovery made was by mistake, through a crack in a wall, by an excavator that dug too deep, by a tunnel that no one had ever traversed again. The silence was not oblivion. It was part of the design, and everything that now comes to light again is nothing more than a fraction of what still remains hidden.